The scrap buyer needed less than 2 minutes to decide what Henry Cole's tractor was worth. $300. Henry looked at him. The buyer kicked one of the rear tires. That's including hauling it away. The tire barely moved. Its sidewall had cracked into hundreds of tiny lines, and the bottom had collapsed beneath the weight of the tractor. Dust covered the faded red hood. Rust had eaten through one corner of the fender, where a battery had once sat. There was only an empty tray covered in corrosion. To anyone walking into the shed, the conclusion seemed obvious. The tractor was finished. Henry's son, Mark, seemed relieved. "Take it." "Dad." Henry didn't answer. At 74, he moved more slowly than he once had. But his eyes still went automatically to machines. Not their paint, not their age. The details. He walked around the tractor. The exhaust stack still wore the crude metal cap Henry had fitted years ago. Beneath the hood, the intake opening remained covered. The engine block was dirty but intact. No obvious crack. No puddle beneath the oil pan. No dismantled parts scattered nearby. The scrap buyer watched him. "She's been sitting how long?" 29 years. The man laughed softly. "Then 300's generous." Mark leaned against the shed door. "That's what I've been telling him." Henry looked at his son. "You've been telling me the engine's bad." Mark shrugged. "Dad, it hasn't run since I was in college." "That isn't what I said." "What difference does it make?" Henry turned toward the tractor. To Mark, 29 years without running was the evidence. To Henry, it was only a lapse time. He remembered something his son didn't. The last afternoon that engine had been warm, the sound it made pulling a wagon toward the north field, the gauge Henry kept watching. The decision he made before sunset, he remembered driving the tractor back into this shed under its own power. But he said none of that. Not yet. The buyer opened the hood. Mice have probably eaten half the wiring. Probably. Henry said, "Fuel system will be full of garbage." "Could be. Pump could be stuck." Henry nodded. "Could be." The buyer looked amused. "And you still think it's worth saving?" "I didn't say that." Henry reached for the dipstick. The oil was dark. That meant almost nothing after nearly 3 decades. He replaced it. The buyer pointed toward the engine. "You want to know what I see?" Henry waited. "I see 1,500 pounds of problems wrapped around $300 of scrap." Mark laughed. Henry didn't. He placed his hand on the hood. There had been a time when that tractor worked almost every day. Planting. Hay. Wagons. Snow. It had earned every worn edge now visible beneath the dust. But Henry wasn't sentimental enough to believe history made machinery healthy. If the engine was ruined, it was ruined. If corrosion had destroyed the cylinders, memories wouldn't repair them. What bothered him was simpler. Nobody had checked. Mark had already called it dead. The buyer had already priced its weight. Neither man knew why it had been parked. Henry did. The buyer closed the hood. "Tell you what, I'll load it today. Saves your family having to deal with it later." Henry looked toward the flat tires. "How?" "Winch." "No." The buyer paused. "No? Not yet." Mark pushed himself away from the doorway. "Dad." Henry ignored him. He walked to an old cabinet against the wall and opened the bottom drawer. Inside were grease guns, rusted fittings, old filters and tools nobody had touched in years. Henry moved several things aside. Then he found what he wanted. A hand crank and a long breaker bar. Mark stared at them. "You're serious?" "I want to know something." The buyer folded his arms. "What?" Henry pointed toward the tractor. "You said the engine's bad." "I said after 29 years it doesn't matter. It matters if you're buying it by the pound." The buyer smiled. "Fine. Put a battery in it." Henry shook his head. "No battery." That surprised both men. Mark frowned. "How are you going to start it?" "I'm not." Henry placed the tools on the workbench. "Not yet." He removed the side panel and began inspecting the engine more closely. The buyer sighed. "If it's seized, you're wasting your time." Henry looked up. "If it's seized, we'll find out without making it worse." That ended the argument. He checked the intake first, then the exhaust. He examined the visible wiring and looked for evidence that water had entered places it shouldn't. Only after that did Henry position the breaker bar. Mark stepped closer. "What exactly are you trying to prove?" Henry placed both hands on the bar. "Nothing." He applied gentle pressure. "No movement." The buyer smiled. Henry stopped immediately. He repositioned his hands. Tried again. Still nothing. Mark looked toward the scrap buyer. The man's expression said everything. $300. Henry released the bar. But he didn't look disappointed. Instead, he stared at the engine as if its refusal had answered a question. "That's enough," he said. Mark frowned. "So it seized?" Henry shook his head. "We don't know that. It didn't move." "That's not the same thing." Henry removed the tool. Then he looked at the old tractor, 29 years earlier. He had driven it into this exact spot and shut it down deliberately. If what he had done before leaving it here had worked, there was still a chance. A small one. Henry reached for his tools. The scrap buyer checked his watch. "What are you doing now?" Henry looked at him. "Finding out whether this engine is stuck." He turned back toward the tractor. "Or whether it's just been asleep a very long time." Henry didn't force the breaker bar. That was the first thing Mark didn't understand. If you're trying to see whether it's seized, put some weight on it. Henry removed the tool. "And if one cylinder's rusted?" Mark stopped. "More force won't tell me why it isn't moving." The scrap buyer leaned against his truck. "You're going to spend all afternoon proving it's junk." Henry ignored him. He removed the spark plugs one at a time. The first resisted. Henry worked it gently back and forth until the threads released. Then the second, then the others. He placed each plug on cardboard in cylinder order. Mark watched. "What are you looking for?" "Water. Rust. Anything that shouldn't be there." The plugs were old and dirty, but none showed the kind of severe corrosion Henry feared. That didn't prove the cylinders were healthy. It simply gave him permission to continue. He shone a light into each opening. Then he added a small amount of penetrating lubricant to the cylinders. "Now what?" "We wait." The buyer laughed. Henry sat on an overturned bucket. For 20 minutes, he did nothing. That was when Mark finally asked the question nobody had asked before. "Why did you park it?" Henry looked toward the tractor. "What?" "You always said something was wrong with it." "What actually happened?" Henry rubbed his hands together. It had been 29 years. But he remembered the afternoon clearly. He had been pulling a loaded wagon from the north field. The tractor wasn't knocking. It wasn't smoking badly. It hadn't lost power. But after several hours of work, Henry noticed something on the instrument panel. Oil pressure. At working speed, the reading looked acceptable. When he pulled back to idle, it fell farther than Henry liked. He increased the throttle. The pressure returned. Slowly. Henry watched it happen twice more that afternoon. Nothing catastrophic. No warning light. No sudden mechanical noise. Just a gauge behaving differently from the way it had behaved for years. "So it still ran?" Mark asked. Henry nodded. "I drove it right here." The buyer unfolded his arms. That was new information. Mark stared at his father. "You've let us think the engine blew up for 30 years. I never said it blew. You said you stopped using it." "I did." "Because of a gauge? Because something changed?" Henry looked at him. "And I didn't know why." That was the part Mark had never understood about his father. Henry didn't need a machine to fail before he respected a warning. A diesel engine could survive wear for years. But lubrication wasn't something he gambled with. Low oil pressure, when hot, could mean several things. Some inexpensive. Some very expensive. Henry had intended to investigate. Then the farm changed. A newer tractor became available from his brother. There was planting to finish. Then harvest. The old tractor remained in the shed. Weeks became months. Eventually, Henry decided that if he wasn't going to repair it immediately, he would at least prepare it to sit. He drained what needed attention. Protected openings from moisture. Put lubricant where he thought it would matter. Covered the intake. Capped the exhaust. Then he left it. He never imagined, for now, would become 29 years. Mark looked at the exhaust cap. You did all that before storing it? Enough of it. Why didn't you ever tell me? You never asked why I parked it. Henry stood. He returned to the engine. The penetrating lubricant had been sitting long enough for another cautious attempt. He fitted the breaker bar again. Don't force it, Mark said. Henry glanced at him. Now his son understood. Henry applied pressure. Nothing. He stopped. Changed the crankshaft position slightly in the opposite direction. A tiny movement. Henry froze. Did that move? Mark asked. Henry didn't answer. He reset the bar and applied pressure again. The mark on the pulley shifted. Not an inch. Barely a fraction. But it moved. The scrap buyer stepped away from his truck. Henry reversed direction gently. The crankshaft moved back. Then forward again. Slightly farther. Mark crouched beside him. So it's not seized. Henry shook his head. Don't get ahead of it. He worked the crankshaft through a slightly larger arc. Back. Forward. Each time. Movement increased. Then Henry felt resistance rise. He stopped immediately. No forcing. He added more lubricant and waited again. 20 minutes later, he tried once more. The crankshaft moved past the point where it had stopped. Then farther. Henry repositioned the breaker bar. Pulled. The pulley turned. A quarter revolution. Then half. Mark's expression changed. The scrap buyer said nothing now. Henry continued slowly until the crankshaft completed one full revolution. No hard stop. He went around again. The second revolution was easier. Henry removed the bar. Mark smiled. So we put the battery in? No. The smile disappeared. Dad. The engine turns. Henry nodded. That tells us one thing. What? It turns. Henry pointed toward the fuel system. Then the cooling system. Then the decades-old wiring. It doesn't tell us any of that works. The scrap buyer finally spoke. But you think it'll start? Henry looked at him. No. He looked back at the tractor. I think you've been calling an engine dead before anybody checked whether it was dead. Henry picked up the first spark plug. For the first time that afternoon, the scrap buyer was no longer looking at the tractor's weight. He was looking at the engine, and Henry knew they had only passed the easiest test. Getting an old engine to move was one thing. Giving it permission to run was something else entirely. The scrap buyer walked back to his truck. When he returned, he was carrying a battery. Let's settle it. He set it beside the tractor. If the engine turns, hook this up and see what happens. Mark looked at Henry. For a moment, the suggestion sounded reasonable. They had already proved the crankshaft could complete 2 revolutions by hand. The engine wasn't obviously locked. Why not use the starter? Henry didn't move. No. The buyer frowned. What are you waiting for? Henry pointed at the engine. For 29 years. That engine hasn't built oil pressure. So I'm not asking it to run until I know what we're asking it to run on. Henry had spent too many years around farm machinery to confuse movement with readiness. The crankshaft turning by hand told him the pistons could travel through the cylinders. It did not tell him whether the oil passages were clear. It didn't tell him whether the cooling system could hold pressure. And it certainly didn't tell him what 29 years had done to the fuel system. Henry pulled the drain plug beneath the fuel tank. At first, nothing came out. Then a dark drop formed. Another followed. Finally, a thin stream ran into the pan. Mark leaned closer and immediately pulled back. That doesn't smell like diesel. It used to. The liquid was dark and contaminated. Sediment followed it from the bottom of the tank. The scrap buyer looked at the pan. You weren't going to start on that anyway. Henry glanced at him. 10 minutes ago you wanted me to. The man said nothing. Henry moved to the fuel filter. What came out there was worse. Old residue. Moisture. Contamination that had settled during decades of temperature changes inside the shed. Henry held up the filter. This is why you don't wake up an old machine by turning the key. Mark stared at it. So the fuel system has to be rebuilt? Didn't say that. Henry was careful with conclusions. Contaminated fuel upstream didn't prove the injection system itself was destroyed. First, They needed to prevent the contamination from traveling any farther. Henry isolated the old tank from the diagnostic process. Then he inspected the cooling system. One hose felt almost like plastic. He squeezed it gently. A crack appeared near the clamp. Mark looked at him. That would have leaked. Eventually. Maybe as soon as it started. Exactly. They replaced only what was necessary for a controlled test. Henry wasn't restoring the tractor. Not yet. Spending hundreds of dollars on tires, paint, hoses, and upholstery before knowing the condition of the engine would be backwards. The engine had to earn the rest. Next came the electrical system. The buyer had been right about the mice. Under one section of the harness, insulation had disappeared entirely. Copper showed through. Another wire had been chewed almost in half. Mark pointed at it. So even if the engine is good, it still might not start. Henry nodded. That distinction mattered. A machine could possess a perfectly salvageable engine and still appear completely dead because everything around that engine had deteriorated. They cleaned connections, protected, exposed wiring, checked the starter circuit. Then Henry returned to lubrication. He drained the old oil. The first flow was thick and dark. Henry watched it closely. Mark expected him to find chunks of metal. He didn't. That was encouraging, but Henry refused to call it proof. After nearly 30 years, absence of visible metal in a drain pan could not tell them what bearing clearances looked like. It could only tell them there was no obvious disaster staring back. Henry replaced the filter and added fresh oil. Then he left the spark plugs out. Mark noticed. Forgot those. No. Henry connected the battery. The scrap buyer stepped closer. So now we're starting it? Henry shook his head. Now we're turning it faster. With the plugs removed, the starter wouldn't have to fight normal cylinder compression. More importantly, the engine could rotate without immediately trying to run. Henry climbed onto the seat. The old cushion compressed beneath him. His hand rested on the key. For a moment, 29 years disappeared. He remembered the last time he'd sat there with the engine warm beneath his boots. Then he turned the key. The starter clicked. Nothing. The buyer gave a quiet laugh. Henry released it. Checked the connection. Tried again. Click. Mark's face fell. Starter's dead? Maybe. Henry climbed down. He cleaned the heavy connections more thoroughly, then checked the ground path. Corrosion had built resistance where metal once met metal cleanly. He corrected it. Again. Mark said. Henry turned the key. This time, re. The crankshaft turned. Dust shook from the engine. Mark smiled. The buyer stepped toward the hood. Henry watched something else. He wasn't listening for the engine to start. It couldn't. He was watching for evidence that fresh oil was beginning to move through a system that had been asleep for almost 3 decades. After several short cranking cycles, Henry stopped. He inspected again. No major leak. No hard mechanical sound. No sudden binding. Only then did he reinstall what was necessary and prepare a temporary supply of clean fuel, separate from the contaminated tank. The buyer looked at his watch. You've spent hours getting to the same place we could have been this morning. Henry looked at the black sludge in the fuel pan, the cracked hose and the damaged wiring lying on the bench. No. He wiped his hands. This morning, turning the key would have told us nothing. No. If the tractor failed to start, they had eliminated several reasons that had nothing to do with the health of the engine itself. Henry climbed back onto the seat. This time, the ignition system was ready. Clean fuel was available. The engine had been lubricated. Mark stood beside the hood. The scrap buyer folded his arms. Henry turned the key. Nothing. 5 seconds. Henry stopped. Silence returned. The buyer smiled. Told you. Henry didn't even look at him. His eyes were fixed on the exhaust. There had been no real smoke. No cough. No attempt to fire. That didn't sound like proof of a dead engine. It sounded like the engine wasn't receiving something it needed. Henry climbed down. Mark looked disappointed. What now? Henry followed the fuel line with his eyes. Now we find out whether the engine failed to start. He reached for a wrench. Or whether we haven't actually given it fuel yet. Henry started at the temporary fuel supply. Clean diesel was available. That didn't mean it was reaching the engine. He followed the line toward the filter housing and loosened the appropriate connection carefully. Watch. Mark leaned closer. Henry operated the priming system. At first, almost nothing appeared. Then a weak mixture of air and fuel. Bubbles. More air. Henry kept working. The scrap buyer watched from several feet away. Air in the lines, among other possibilities. Henry wasn't surprised. After 29 years, seals could dry. Connections could admit air. Old fuel could leave deposits. A line that looked open from the outside might be restricted internally. A diesel needed fuel delivered under the right conditions. A full tank meant nothing if the fuel never reached the cylinders properly. Henry continued bleeding the low-pressure side until clean fuel appeared without the stream of bubbles. Then he stopped. Mark pointed toward the seat. Tree it now? Not yet. Henry moved farther downstream. The buyer sighed. You always this slow? Henry looked at him. Only when going fast can cost me an engine. He checked the fuel path one stage at a time. Tank source. Line. Filter. Pump supply. Each test answered one question before Henry moved to the next. Eventually, the problem became clearer. Fuel was reaching the pump, but delivery beyond it wasn't behaving the way Henry expected. That could be bad. An injection pump that had sat for almost 3 decades could develop internal sticking or deterioration. If that had happened severely enough, the tractor might need expensive work before it ever fired. The buyer smiled again. There's your scrap tractor. Henry ignored him. He had learned long ago not to diagnose machinery from the price of the worst possible repair. He inspected the control linkage, moved it gently. Something felt wrong. Mark? His son came closer. Move that lever. Mark did. Henry watched the linkage at the pump. Again. Back. Mark moved it back. Henry pointed. See that? Mark shook his head. The lever moves. Henry touched the linkage farther down. But not all of it. Years of sitting had left part of the mechanism reluctant to travel through its full range. Not broken. Not proven good either. Henry worked it carefully. No hammer. No excessive force. A little movement. Then more. Gradually the mechanism began traveling farther. Mark watched. That can keep it from starting? If the pump isn't being told to deliver fuel correctly. Yes. The scrap buyer stepped closer now. His amusement had begun turning into curiosity. Henry returned to the fuel system. They bled it again. This time the response changed. Henry looked at Mark. Now, they moved back to the tractor. Henry climbed onto the seat. 5 seconds. He turned the key. Rrr. Nothing. Then, a faint gray puff left the exhaust. Henry immediately released the key. Mark pointed. Smoke. I saw it. That means fuel? It means something changed. Henry refused to turn one puff into a diagnosis. But this attempt was different from the first. Before, the exhaust had been almost dead. Now at least one cylinder appeared to be receiving something it could attempt to burn. Henry checked the system again. No obvious leaks. He returned to the seat. Second attempt. Rar. Cough. Mark's head snapped toward the exhaust. The buyer unfolded his arms. Henry kept cranking for another moment. Rrr, cough, rrr. Then stopped. Silence. Mark grinned. It fired. It tried. Same difference. No. Henry climbed down. A cough proved the engine could produce combustion somewhere. It did not prove all cylinders were healthy. It did not prove the injection system was correct. And it certainly didn't prove the tractor could safely run still. Henry felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel all day. Hope. Not because the tractor had almost started, because the evidence was beginning to separate storage problems from engine problems. The corroded electrical connections had made the starter appear dead. The contaminated fuel had made the fuel system useless. The sticking linkage had prevented proper delivery. None of those things proved the engine itself was ruined. 29 years had damaged the systems surrounding the engine. That wasn't the same as 29 years destroying the engine. The buyer looked toward the faded tractor differently now. "What would you take for it if it runs?" Mark smiled. Henry didn't. "We're a long way from that." He prepared for another attempt. Clean fuel. Fuel system bled. Linkage moving. Battery still strong. Henry turned the key. Cough, cough. The engine stumbled harder. For half a second, it almost caught. Henry released the key immediately. Mark stared at him. "Why'd you stop?" Henry remained motionless on the seat. Something had returned to him. Not a sound from today. A memory. The last afternoon he had driven this tractor. The engine hot. The wagon behind him. His hand reducing the throttle near the shed. And the oil pressure needle falling lower than it ever had before. Henry looked toward the gauge panel. 29 years earlier. That needle had been the reason he parked the tractor. He had spent the entire day trying to determine whether the old engine could run. Now he remembered the more important question, whether it should. "Don't crank it again." Mark's smile disappeared. "What's wrong?" Henry climbed slowly from the seat. He pointed toward the lubrication system. "Before this engine fires again, we're going to find out why I shut it down in the first place." Mark stared at his father. "You stopped because of something that happened 29 years ago?" Henry nodded. The scrap buyer looked toward the tractor. "It almost started." "That isn't the point." Henry opened the hood again. For most of the afternoon, they had been trying to prove the engine wasn't dead. Now they had enough evidence to believe it could produce combustion. That changed the job. A few seconds of firing probably wouldn't prove much. But if the engine started, and Henry allowed it to run while the old lubrication problem still existed, they could damage the very thing they were trying to save. Mark pointed toward the dashboard. "Can't we just watch the gauge?" Henry shook his head. "That gauge is 29 years older than the last time I trusted it." He remembered that final afternoon clearly. The tractor had been working normally most of the day. Oil pressure looked familiar while the engine was cold. It remained acceptable at working speed. The change appeared only after several hours. Henry had reached the farmyard with the engine fully warm and reduced the throttle. The needle dropped, lower than usual. He increased engine speed. The needle climbed again, but slowly. He tried it once more. Same behavior. There had been no knock. No sudden loss of power. Nothing dramatic enough to force him to stop. Henry stopped anyway. "Could have just been the gauge." Mark said. "Could have." "Or the sender." "Could have." "Then why park a whole tractor?" Henry looked at him. "Because it also could have been real." Low hot oil pressure could come from several places. Some relatively minor. Others deep inside an engine. Henry hadn't known which. And until he did, continuing to work the tractor under load would have been a gamble. The scrap buyer pointed toward the oil pan. "You think the bearings were worn?" "I don't know." Henry's answer came immediately. That was important. He hadn't parked the tractor because he knew the bearings were failing. He had parked it because he didn't know. Henry removed the old pressure sender connection. Mark watched. "What are you doing?" "Taking the dashboard out of the argument." Henry retrieved a mechanical pressure gauge from his tools. If the engine started, he wanted a direct reading rather than relying on decades-old wiring. Sender resistance, and an instrument panel that hadn't moved since Mark was young. But first Henry wanted pressure before combustion. He disabled the engine's ability to start again, then used the starter in short intervals. Henry watched the mechanical gauge. Nothing. He stopped. Mark's expression tightened. Again. "Rrr." The needle trembled, then moved. Henry leaned closer. Again. The starter turned. Pressure climbed. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. Henry raised his hand. "Stop." Mark released the control. "So the pump works." "It built pressure while cranking." Henry corrected him. "That is what we know." He checked for leaks. "None." Then they repeated the test. Pressure appeared sooner the second time. The oil passages that had been dry for decades were receiving lubricant again. The scrap buyer looked at the gauge. "So start it." Henry still wasn't ready. The old problem hadn't appeared cold. That was precisely what made it dangerous to misunderstand. Cold oil was thicker. An engine, with excessive internal clearances, could sometimes show acceptable pressure cold, then lose it as the oil warmed and thinned. If they wanted to understand what Henry had seen 29 years earlier, eventually, the engine would have to reach operating temperature. But Henry wanted one more thing before taking that risk. He inspected the old sender and its connection. Corrosion covered the terminal. The wiring was brittle. Mark watched him clean it. "You think this was the problem? Today?" Henry nodded toward the corrosion. "Could be part of it? 29 years ago?" Henry shook his head. "This corrosion doesn't tell us what the connection looked like then." That was the difficulty. Time had added new faults on top of the old ones. They couldn't use today's deterioration to rewrite yesterday's diagnosis. Henry installed the mechanical gauge where he could see it clearly. Then he restored the fuel system for another controlled attempt. Mark climbed beside the tractor. "Ready?" Henry checked everything again. Clean fuel. Lubrication established. Cooling system prepared. No obvious leak. Starter strong. He sat down. His hand reached for the key, then stopped. The scrap buyer sighed. "What now?" Henry pointed at the gauge. "When it starts." "Nobody watches the smoke." Mark nodded. "Nobody listens to how good it sounds." He looked at both men. "We watch that needle." Henry turned the key. "Rrr, cough." Again. "Rrr, cough, cough." The engine caught for 1 second, then died. Henry watched the gauge. Pressure rose. Second attempt. "Rrr, bear, bear." The tractor shook. For 2 seconds the engine ran without the starter. Henry shut it down himself. Mark stared at him. "Why?" Henry pointed at the gauge. "It has pressure." "Then what's wrong?" "Nothing yet." Henry climbed down. "The warning I saw 29 years ago didn't happen in 2 seconds. He looked at the old tractor. Everyone had assumed Henry stopped using it because it failed. Now, Mark finally understood. The opposite might have been true. Henry had stopped early enough that it never got the chance to fail. And before they let that engine run long enough to become warm, Henry intended to find out whether that decision had saved it. Henry didn't try to start the tractor again. Instead, he went back to the fuel system. Mark frowned. "I thought we were worried about oil pressure." "We are." "Then why are you looking at fuel? Because if we're going to warm the engine, it has to run cleanly enough to test." The tractor had fired. That proved combustion was possible. It did not prove the fuel system was ready to keep the engine running. Henry looked at the temporary clean fuel line they had installed earlier. It had bypassed the worst contamination in the tank. But the tractor's original fuel system had spent 29 years sitting with residue inside it. That mattered. A diesel injection system depended on small passages, controlled movement, and precise delivery. Dirt that looked insignificant in a drain pan could become a serious problem farther downstream. Henry removed the old filter and cut it open. Mark leaned over. Inside, the material was dark, not merely stained, loaded. "That's been sitting between the tank and pump all these years?" Henry nodded. "And that's exactly where I want it to stay." The scrap buyer pointed toward the injection pump. "You think that pump's ruined?" Henry shook his head. "If it were completely dead, we probably wouldn't have gotten those 2 seconds." He inspected the linkage again. Yesterday or 29 years ago, depending on how Henry thought about it, the mechanism had moved freely. Today, age had added resistance. That was the problem with an old tractor. It could have one fault from the day it was parked, and 10 new ones created while sitting. Henry wanted to keep those histories separate. He disconnected another section of fuel line. A dark deposit clung to the inside. Mark looked at it. "That's enough to stop it?" "Enough in the wrong place can—" Henry cleaned only what was necessary for testing and replaced the filter. Then they supplied fresh fuel again. He operated the priming system until the flow was clean and free of obvious air. The scrap buyer watched more closely now. He hadn't mentioned $300 in over an hour. Henry bled the system methodically. 1 point. Then another. No rushing. When he finished, he wiped every connection dry. "Why?" Mark asked. "So if something leaks, I know it's new. Henry restored the starting circuit. Then he pointed at the mechanical oil pressure gauge. Same rule. Mark nodded. Watch the needle. Henry climbed onto the tractor. He turned the key. Rrr. A gray puff rose. Cough, burr, brr. The engine caught. This time, Henry let go of the key. The starter disengaged. For the first time in 29 years, the crankshaft continued turning by combustion alone. Broom, 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 broom. The tractor shook. Dust fell from beneath the hood. Mark smiled so hard he almost laughed. The scrap buyer stepped forward. Henry looked at neither of them. His eyes stayed on the gauge. Pressure. Good. For now. Don't touch the throttle. The engine stumbled. Recovered. Then stumbled again. Henry listened. That roughness could be storage. Air still leaving the fuel system. Uneven delivery. Ignition of old deposits. Or something mechanical. He wasn't going to diagnose it from 30 seconds of running. Then the engine died. Mark's smile disappeared. What happened? Henry climbed. He knew. Good question. The buyer looked satisfied again. Maybe that's all she's got. Henry checked the fuel line. There, a small pocket of air. He traced backward and found a connection that wasn't sealing consistently. Not enough to pour fuel onto the floor. Enough to admit air. Henry corrected it. Then they tried again. The tractor started faster. Better. This time the idle held 1 minute. Tfo. Henry watched oil pressure. Still healthy. The engine remained cold. That was important. The old warning had not arrived yet. As the diesel ran, Henry placed his hand near the upper cooling hose. Still cool. Mark stood beside him. You really parked it because of that gauge? Henry nodded. For almost 30 years? I didn't plan the 30 years. Then why didn't you fix it that winter? Henry remained quiet. The answer wasn't mechanical. That year, his brother offered him a newer tractor at a price he couldn't refuse. Then Henry's wife needed surgery. The farm demanded attention elsewhere. By the following spring, the newer tractor had taken over the old one's work. The red tractor became tomorrow's job. Tomorrow became next year. Eventually, Henry stopped needing it. But he never forgot the needle. Mark looked toward the machine. So this thing might have been usable the whole time? Henry shook his head. Don't rewrite history yet. The engine had not proven that. They still didn't know whether the old pressure loss had been a faulty indication, a lubrication system problem, or internal wear. The temperature gauge began moving. Henry noticed immediately. The engine was finally warming. Oil was thinning. Conditions were approaching the ones under which Henry had seen the original warning. 5 minutes passed. Then 8. The mechanical pressure gauge began to fall at idle. Not suddenly. Gradually. Mark saw it. Dad. I see it. The scrap buyer stepped closer. The needle settled lower. Henry's face changed. 29 years disappeared. Same tractor. Same warm engine. Same falling pressure. Mark's voice became quiet. So you were right. Henry shook his head. No. He watched the needle. I was right to stop. That was different. The warning was real. They still didn't know the cause. Henry raised the engine speed slightly. The pressure increased. Then he returned it to idle. The needle fell again. Exactly the behavior he remembered. Henry shut the tractor down. The barn became silent. The scrap buyer looked at him. Bearings? Maybe. Oil pump? Maybe. Mark sighed. What do we actually know? Henry looked at the gauge. We know 29 years didn't create the problem. Then he looked toward the oil pan. It was waiting here the whole time. Henry reached for his tools. Now the tractor had finally brought them back to the exact mechanical question that had ended its working life. And this time, Henry intended to answer it. Henry waited until the engine was cool enough to work around. Mark expected him to remove the oil pan. Instead, Henry removed the mechanical gauge. Why take that off? I want to know whether the measurement changes when the instrument changes. He connected another known gauge. The scrap buyer shook his head. You already proved the pressure drops. We proved one gauge says it drops. Henry started the tractor again. This time it caught quickly. Cold pressure rose immediately. They waited. 5 minutes. 10. As the engine warmed, the needle began falling. Henry increased the throttle slightly. Pressure climbed. Back at idle. It fell again. Nearly the same readings. Henry shut it down. Mark folded his arms. So the old dashboard gauge wasn't lying. Not completely. That eliminated the easiest explanation. Henry opened the hood farther and stared at the engine. The scrap buyer spoke first. If those bearings are worn out, you're finally back to my $300. Henry ignored the number. Bearing wear was possible. So was oil pump wear. Excessive internal clearance somewhere in the lubrication system could bleed pressure as the oil became thinner. But Henry remembered something else now. Something from the weeks before he parked the tractor. Get that old filter. Mark pointed toward the bench. The one we removed? Henry nodded. Mark brought it over. Henry looked at the filter. Then at the housing on the tractor, 29 years earlier. He had changed the oil shortly before noticing the pressure behavior. He remembered because he'd been preparing the tractor for several weeks of heavy wagon work. Fresh oil. Fresh filter. Then the strange pressure drop. At the time, he had assumed the two events were unrelated. Now he wasn't so certain. You think the filter caused it? Mark asked. I think something changed before the gauge changed. Henry examined the lubrication system instead of jumping directly to the bearings. That was the temptation with low hot oil pressure. Assume the deepest, most expensive failure first. But before condemning the engine, Henry wanted to eliminate everything between the oil pan and the pressure gallery that could be checked without tearing the block apart. They inspected the filter arrangement, then the pressure control components. Henry cleaned decades of residue away from a small assembly and removed it carefully. A spring, a valve, a bore controlling oil flow and pressure. Mark leaned closer. That little thing? Don't know yet. Henry inspected the valve surface. There was visible wear. More importantly, movement through the bore wasn't smooth. The valve hesitated. Henry pushed gently. It moved, then caught again. The scrap buyer looked unimpressed. That explains 29 years? Henry shook his head. It explains why we're not opening the bottom of the engine yet. A pressure-regulating valve that didn't seat or move correctly could allow oil to bypass when it shouldn't. Whether this was the entire cause remained unproven, but it was real evidence. They cleaned the assembly and measured what they could. The spring had also weakened, compared with what Henry expected. Mark looked at the worn pieces in his father's hand. You parked the tractor because of that? No. Henry looked at him. I parked it because I didn't know whether it was that or the bearings. That was the distinction Mark had finally begun to understand. Henry had not diagnosed the tractor 29 years earlier. He had recognized a warning and refused to continue loading the engine until he understood it. Then life moved on before he finished. They serviced the pressure control assembly and reinstalled it. Fresh oil remained in the engine. The mechanical gauge stayed connected. Mark looked toward the seat. Now? Henry nodded. Now we test the idea. The tractor started on the second attempt. Cold pressure rose. Nobody celebrated. They waited for temperature. 5 minutes. 8. 10. The needle dropped as the oil warmed. Mark's face tightened. Then it stopped. Higher than before. Henry said nothing. He let the engine become fully warm. Idle. Pressure held. He increased engine speed. The needle climbed immediately. Back to idle. It fell, then stabilized. No slow collapse. No delayed recovery. The exact behavior Henry remembered from 29 years earlier was gone. Mark stared at the gauge. That was it. Henry shook his head. That's what changed when we repaired it. You still won't say it? Not until we put the engine under load. The scrap buyer looked toward the tractor. For the first time, he wasn't smiling. If the pressure remained stable under real working conditions, the engine he had valued by weight might still have useful life inside it. Henry shut the tractor down. Mark looked confused. Why stop now? Henry removed his gloves. Because before we load it, We're checking everything again." He pointed toward the ancient tires. "And we're not driving anywhere on those." The buyer laughed once. "So after all this, the tires stop you?" Henry looked at him. "No." He placed the worn pressure control parts on the bench. "Knowing when to stop is why this engine is still here." Mark looked at the tiny pieces. That was when the larger truth became clear. 29 years ago. Henry's caution had looked unnecessary. The tractor still ran. The engine wasn't knocking. The work wasn't finished. There had been no dramatic failure. But Henry had seen one measurement change and stopped before a warning became damage. Everyone had spent decades saying the tractor had been parked because something was wrong with it. They were right. They had simply misunderstood the important part. The problem hadn't killed the tractor. Henry had stopped using it before it could. And now, nearly 3 decades later, that decision was about to face its final test. By the next morning, the tractor no longer looked like scrap to Mark. It still had flat tires, still wore 30 years of dust, still had cracked paint and rust around the fenders. But now there was a difference. They had heard it run. More importantly, they had watched the oil pressure remain stable after the pressure control system was serviced. The scrap buyer returned, just after 9. Henry was already beneath the hood. "You really think that little valve was the whole problem?" the buyer asked. Henry didn't look up. "I think we found a problem." "That isn't what I asked." "I know." Henry had no intention of turning one successful warm idle test into proof that the engine was healthy. The original warning had appeared while the tractor was working. Under load. Hot. That was where the final answer had to come from. But before they could test it there, Henry wanted to know whether the decades of storage had left another weakness waiting to appear. They checked the cooling system again. The old hoses had been replaced for testing. Coolant circulation looked normal. No obvious contamination appeared in the oil. No external leak developed as the engine warmed. Then Henry inspected the temporary fuel arrangement. Mark watched him tighten a connection. "We already fixed that." "We fixed what leaked yesterday." Henry pointed at it. "Today I'm checking whether it stayed fixed." That was how Henry treated every repair. A wrench turning a bolt was not proof. The machine had to confirm the work afterward. They fitted serviceable wheels and tires borrowed from another tractor on the farm so the old machine could be moved safely without investing in a full restoration. Then Henry checked the brakes. One side dragged. He corrected it before the tractor moved 10 feet. By noon, the machine was ready for something it hadn't done in nearly 3 decades. Move under its own power. Mark climbed toward the seat. Henry stopped him. "I'll take it. You think I can't drive a tractor? I think I remember what this one feels like when something changes." Mark stepped down. Henry settled into the old seat. His boots found the pedals automatically. For a second, his hands rested on controls, polished smooth by years of use. Then he started the engine. Brum. It caught quickly. The scrap buyer looked toward Mark. Neither said anything. Henry watched the mechanical oil pressure gauge. Cold pressure came up normally. He let the engine warm. Only when the temperature approached the range they had seen the day before did he select gear. The tractor rolled forward. Slowly. The tires crossed the threshold of the shed. Sunlight reached the hood for the first time in 29 years. Mark smiled. Henry didn't. He drove 20 yards. Stopped. Checked the gauge. Turned. Returned. No load yet. The engine sounded steady. Pressure remained where Henry wanted it. The scrap buyer walked beside the tractor when Henry stopped. "So now it's fixed." Henry shook his head. "Now it drives across a yard." The man laughed. "You'd make a terrible salesman." "Good thing I'm not selling it." Henry looked toward an old empty wagon near the fence. That was the next test. Not a plow. Not a heavy implement. Just enough resistance to make the engine work beyond idle. They connected the wagon. Henry drove again. The engine note deepened slightly. Oil pressure held. One lap around the yard. Then another. Henry stopped. Mark climbed onto the step. "Well, better." "You've been waiting 29 years for this, and all I get is better?" Henry looked at the gauge. 29 years is exactly why I'm not rushing the last 20 minutes. Then he remembered the north field, the last real load the tractor had pulled. A wagon heavier than this one, the engine fully warm, throttle reduced near the shed, pressure falling too low. Henry looked toward the hill behind the barn. Mark followed his eyes. No. Henry smiled faintly. That's where we're going. They added weight to the wagon. Not enough to punish the tractor. Enough to make the engine produce real torque. Henry drove toward the slope. The engine note changed as the grade increased. Brum, brum. Mark walked alongside for the first few yards, watching the gauge mounted where Henry could see it, halfway up. The engine was fully loaded. Henry remembered this sound. Not exactly, but close enough to bring back the afternoon when he had decided to stop. He watched the pressure. Steady. At the top of the slope, Henry turned and came back toward the barn. The real moment arrived when he reduced the throttle. Engine speed fell. Oil pressure dropped with it. Mark stared at the needle. So did Henry. It fell, then stopped. Henry increased the throttle. The needle responded immediately. No hesitation. He returned to idle. Again. The pressure settled above the level that had frightened him 29 years earlier. Henry shut the engine down. The scrap buyer approached. So it was that valve. Henry picked up the old pressure control pieces from the workbench. Probably a major part of it. Meaning the engine was never bad. Henry shook his head. It's an old engine. Of course it's worn. He looked at the tractor. But worn and ruined aren't the same thing. That was what Henry had been afraid of all those years ago. Not a bad gauge. Not a small valve. He had been afraid the falling pressure was the first visible sign of clearances opening deep inside the engine where, serious enough that continuing to pull heavy loads might turn a repairable tractor into a destroyed one. He hadn't known. So he stopped. The buyer looked at the machine differently now. You could have kept running it back then. Maybe. And it might have been fine. Maybe. Henry closed his hand around the worn part. Or maybe another afternoon under load would have cost me the engine. Mark finally understood why his father had never regretted parking it. Henry hadn't known the tractor would survive 29 years. He hadn't been preserving it for some future resurrection. He had simply refused to gamble an engine to finish one more day's work. The buyer looked at the faded hood. $300 isn't going to buy it anymore. Is it? Henry smiled. It never did. Then he looked toward the tractor. The engine had passed the test Henry had postponed for nearly 3 decades. But there was still one question left. Not whether it could run. Whether Henry trusted it enough to work again. Chapter 9. Don't restore it. Prove it. Mark was already making a list. Tiers. Wiring. Seat. Oza. Maybe paint. Henry took the pencil from his hand. No. Mark stared at him. The tractor just pulled a loaded wagon uphill. Once. And the oil pressure held. Once. Mark pointed toward the faded red machine. What else does it have to prove? Henry looked at him. That it can do it again. That was the difference between bringing an engine back to life and putting a tractor back to work. A first start made a good story. A second start made evidence. Henry walked around the machine. Now that everyone had stopped wondering whether the engine was dead, smaller problems became easier to see. A damp fuel connection. Play in the steering. A hydraulic hose hardened by age. Charging voltage that wasn't staying where Henry wanted it. 29 years hadn't destroyed the engine, but 29 years had still happened. Fix all of it? Mark asked. No. Henry pointed toward the tractor. Fix what keeps us from testing it. They let the engine cool completely. While they waited, Henry pulled the oil filter they'd installed during the first runs. Mark frowned. That filter's almost new. Exactly. Henry cut it open. The oil was dirtier than fresh oil should have been. Not surprising. Decades of deposits were being disturbed now that hot oil was circulating again. Henry spread the filter material beneath the light. Mark leaned closer. Metal? Henry searched carefully. Nothing obvious. No glittering trail. No fragments that suggested the engine was eating itself. Henry nodded once. That was enough to continue. Fresh filter. Fresh oil. Then he corrected the fuel seep and marked the connection with chalk. If it's wet after the next run, we know it came back. The hydraulic response was slow. Henry serviced only what the test justified. It improved. Then he stopped working. Mark looked confused. That's it? For today? We still have hours of daylight. Henry looked toward the engine. I don't want daylight. He wanted the tractor cold. Not 10 minutes off cold. Not warm enough to hide weak starting behavior. Cold enough that tomorrow morning the machine would have to prove itself without help from the previous run. The scrap buyer laughed. You finally get it running and now you're waiting for it to get harder to start? Henry closed the toolbox. I'd rather find the problem here than 5 miles from the barn. That evening, the tractor sat outside the shed. No charger connected. No warm engine. No second chance hidden inside residual heat. Mark looked at the cracked seat. So we don't buy anything yet? Henry shook his head. Not until tomorrow. What changes tomorrow? Nothing. Henry looked at the tractor. That's the point. Before sunrise the next morning, Henry returned alone. The metal hood was cold beneath his hand. He checked the oil. Then coolant. Then the chalk mark beside the fuel fitting. Dry. Mark arrived as Henry climbed onto the seat. You waited for me? Henry looked at him. I waited for the tractor. The scrap buyer's truck appeared at the end of the lane. Apparently, he wanted the answer too. Henry placed his hand on the key. 29 years of silence had already been broken. That wasn't the test anymore. Yesterday, the tractor had been warm, recently serviced and surrounded by tools. Today, it had only itself. Henry turned the key. Nothing. Mark's smile disappeared. Henry released the key immediately. The scrap buyer said nothing. A faint gray trace drifted from the exhaust. Henry watched it disappear. Then he climbed down. Mark frowned. What happened? Henry didn't answer. He checked the fuel connection they had repaired. Dry. Then another. Still dry. He looked at the tractor for several seconds. Yesterday had proved the old diesel could run. This morning had just reminded them of something more important. A machine could pass one test, and still fail the next. Henry reached for a wrench. Mark looked toward the unfinished shopping list on the workbench. Henry followed his eyes. No tires. Then he looked back at the silent tractor. No paint. He opened the hood. Not yet. Because before Henry spent $1 making the tractor look alive, it still had to prove it could wake up on its own. The next morning, Henry arrived before Mark. The tractor sat outside the shed with serviceable tires now fitted, but everything else remained almost exactly as they had found it. Faded paint. Cracked seat. Rust along the fenders. Henry wanted it that way for now. The engine had proved it deserved saving. Today, he wanted to prove something harder. That it could be trusted. Mark arrived carrying coffee. You're starting it? Henry nodded. Cold. That mattered. Yesterday's warm restarts had been encouraging. But a cold diesel, after sitting overnight, would reveal problems that a warm engine could hide. Henry checked the oil first. Correct level. Then coolant. No loss. He looked beneath the tractor. Dry enough. Only then did he climb onto the seat. Mark stood beside the engine. Henry turned the key. The engine didn't start. He released it immediately. Mark waited. Henry tried again. A gray puff left the exhaust. Then silence. Mark frowned. It started easier yesterday. It was warmer yesterday. Henry climbed down. He wasn't concerned yet. A machine that had been dormant for 29 years didn't become dependable because it behaved correctly once. He checked fuel delivery. One small air bubble appeared where he didn't want it. Henry tightened the connection they had already been watching, then bled the line again. Back on the seat. Third attempt. Rrrr. Cough brr-am. The tractor shook. The engine caught. Henry released the key. His eyes went directly to the mechanical pressure gauge. The needle rose. Strong? Mark smiled. Henry didn't. Not yet. 5 minutes passed. then 10. As the engine warmed, Henry watched the pressure fall gradually toward its normal hot range. It stopped exactly where it had the previous day. Henry increased the throttle. The needle responded immediately. Back to idle. Stable. That was the first real victory. Not the sound. Not the smoke. Repeatability. Henry selected gear and drove toward the wagon. This time, they had added more weight. Not enough to abuse the tractor. Enough to make it work. He engaged the clutch. The engine note deepened. The tractor moved. At the hill, Henry increased the throttle and let the engine pull. Broom, 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 broom. No knock. Temperature stayed controlled. Oil pressure held. At the top, Henry stopped. He let the engine return to idle. Mark had driven up behind him in the pickup. He jumped out and looked at the gauge. Still steady. That's it. Isn't it? Henry listened for several seconds, then nodded. That's enough for me. Mark smiled. 29 years earlier, Henry had driven this same tractor back into the shed because one gauge had changed. Everyone later assumed the machine had failed. Now, the truth was sitting in front of them, idling steadily. The tractor hadn't died. Henry had stopped it before the warning had the chance to become a failure. Mark leaned against the fender. So you really never knew it would start? No. But you kept it all these years? Henry looked across the field. I knew how it stopped. That was the difference. Everyone else saw 29 silent years and imagined 29 years of decay. Henry remembered the final 10 minutes before the silence began. A running engine. A falling gauge. A decision not to gamble. Mark looked back toward the shed. If we'd sold it yesterday, then somebody would have bought a tractor by weight. Henry eased the throttle forward. The old diesel answered immediately. Mark smiled. What are you doing? Henry selected gear. Taking it back to the north field? Why? Henry looked toward the same ground where he'd first noticed the warning nearly 3 decades earlier. Because that's where the test started. The tractor moved forward. This time, nobody was asking whether it could start. They were watching an old machine return to the place where its working life had stopped. By the time Henry returned from the north field, the scrap buyer's truck was parked beside the shed again. He stepped out as Henry approached. The old tractor came down the lane, pulling the weighted wagon steadily behind it. No smoke cloud. No knocking. No overheating. Just the deep, even rhythm of an old diesel working again. Henry stopped near the barn. He reduced the throttle. Everyone looked at the mechanical oil pressure gauge. The needle dropped, then held, exactly where Henry wanted it. The buyer walked around the tractor. Yesterday, he had inspected it like scrap. Today, he looked at the engine. How long did you run it? About 40 minutes. Under load? Most of it. Temperature? Normal. Pressure? Henry pointed at the gauge. You can see it. The buyer nodded slowly. Then he asked a very different question. What would you sell it for? Mark laughed. Henry shut off the engine. The tractor coasted into silence. Yesterday you offered 300. That was yesterday. What changed? The buyer looked at him as if the answer were obvious. It runs. Henry shook his head. It ran before you got here yesterday. The man frowned. No. It didn't. You never asked? Henry climbed down. Last time I used this tractor, I drove it into that shed. He pointed toward the dark corner where it had spent 29 years. The engine didn't seize. It didn't throw a rod. It didn't quit in a field. Then why park it? Oil pressure changed when it got hot. Henry explained how the needle had fallen too low at idle and recovered slowly. The buyer glanced toward the worn pressure control parts on the workbench. So you stopped using a running tractor because of that? Yes. Most farmers would have kept going. Henry looked at him. Most engines will keep going right up until they don't. Mark stayed quiet. He finally understood what his father had done. Henry hadn't saved the tractor through some brilliant repair 29 years ago. He had saved it by refusing to demand one more day's work from an engine that was warning him. The buyer touched the faded fender. 800. Henry smiled. No. 1,000. Still no. What's it worth? Then, Henry looked at the tractor. Its tires weren't original anymore. The fuel system still needed proper long-term service. There were wires to replace and seals to watch. The seat was cracked. The paint was terrible. It wasn't suddenly valuable because it had started, but it was no longer an unknown pile of iron. They had evidence. The engine rotated freely. It built oil pressure. It maintained that pressure hot. It carried load. It restarted. Those facts changed the machine's value more than any coat of paint could. The buyer raised his offer again. Henry stopped him. "I'm not selling." "Then why prove it runs?" Henry looked surprised by the question. "I wasn't proving anything to you." The buyer went silent. Henry had needed to know whether the tractor deserved to be saved before spending money restoring it. Now he knew. The buyer looked toward the wagon. "Yesterday I would have cut it up for parts." Henry nodded. "And today you'd buy it?" "Because today I know what it is." Henry shook his head. "No." He placed a hand on the hood. "Today you know what it can still do." The buyer looked at the tractor for another moment, then walked toward his truck. Before climbing in, he turned. "Guess 300 was a little low." Henry smiled. 300 was probably fair. The buyer stared at him. "For scrap." Henry looked at the old tractor. "But you weren't looking at scrap." The buyer drove away. Mark remained beside his father. For the first time, nobody was discussing what the tractor weighed. The question had changed completely. Not, "How much is it worth dead?" but, "How many years of work might still be left inside it?" The following morning, Mark found Henry in the shed. The tractor was parked in the same corner where it had spent 29 years. But something had changed. There was no dust on the hood now. Fresh tire marks crossed the floor. A small drop of oil beneath the engine had been circled with chalk so Henry could see whether it grew. Mark smiled. "You're still checking it?" Henry looked up from the dipstick. "That's what you do with an old machine." Mark leaned against the workbench. "So what happens now?" "Fuel tank comes off. Wiring gets finished properly. Then brakes. Hydraulics. Hose. Paint?" Henry looked at the faded hood. "Last." Mark laughed. He had expected that answer. For several minutes they worked without speaking. Then Mark asked the question that had been bothering him. "Dad, why did you keep it?" Henry stopped. "You had the newer tractor. You weren't using this one. Why not sell it 30 years ago?" Henry looked toward the seat. "I thought I'd get back to it." "And then?" "Didn't need to. That was all. No grand plan. No belief that the tractor would someday become valuable. Life had simply moved faster than the repair." Mark looked at the old diesel. "All those years. I thought it was dead." "I know. You never corrected me?" Henry shrugged. "You never needed it." Mark picked up the small pressure control component they had removed. Something this small had helped change the entire story. "Did you know this was the problem?" "No." "You suspected it?" "No." Mark frowned. "Then what did you know?" Henry wiped his hands. "I knew what happened the last time I drove it." That was the only advantage Henry had possessed from the beginning. The scrap buyer had seen flat tires, rust, missing battery, ruined fuel, and decades of silence. Mark had seen the same things. Henry saw them too. But he also remembered what none of those things could reveal. The engine had been running when he parked it. There had been no knock, no seizure, no catastrophic failure. Only a pressure reading that changed when the engine became hot. Henry hadn't known whether the cause was minor or serious. So he stopped. "You really thought continuing could destroy it?" "I thought continuing before I knew the cause was unnecessary." Mark turned the worn component in his hand. "And stopping might be why it's still good." "Might be." Henry wouldn't claim more than the evidence allowed. The engine was still old. It still had wear. There would be other repairs. Yesterday's successful load test didn't erase 29 years. But it proved something simpler. Age alone hadn't decided the tractor's fate. Mark walked to the driver's seat. "Can I start it?" Henry nodded. "Check the oil first." "I watched you check it." "Then check it again." Mark smiled, but obeyed. Oil, coolant, fuel. Then he climbed aboard. The starter turned. Do BRRAM. The old diesel settled into a steady idle. Mark watched the oil pressure gauge. Henry noticed. That made him smile. Not the sound of the engine. Not the fact that the tractor had escaped the scrap truck. His son was watching the gauge. Mark looked down at him. Pressure's good. Henry nodded. Let it warm before you decide that. 29 years earlier, Henry had done exactly that. He had watched. He had noticed something change. And instead of demanding another load from the machine, he had listened to the warning. People later called the tractor abandoned. Henry had never thought of it that way. He had simply stopped before damage made the decision for him. Mark eased the tractor out of the shed. Henry stood in the doorway and listened as the old diesel moved toward the field. Everyone else had looked at 29 silent years and seen a machine slowly dying. Henry remembered the 10 minutes before those years began. They thought the tractor had spent 29 years dying. Henry knew it had spent 29 years waiting,